So we were starting here with an orientation to the wider worker co-op sector and just getting started with, I'm not going to unpack this slide, just I will mention that we, in the US context, managed to organize a national federation a little over 15 years ago, which we're turning 16 actually this year. And that was, I think, an important milestone, not only in coordinating the sector as it was and starting to connect the dots a little bit around worker co-op development and established worker co-ops and resourcing them, but also becoming a catalyst for future sector development. And in fact, we were one of the last areas of the world to sort of organize existing cooperatives into a national federation. So I'll show you some context about that in a moment. But it also gave us a platform from which to engage with other movements for social, racial, and economic justice. And I will not say that much about the broader movement side. I think we'll be able to have an Ujima conversation about that in a couple of weeks in one of these future sessions. But about 5 or 6 years, well, maybe more than that, 6 or 7 years ago, we then created our nonprofit, and as a sort of, I don't know, daughter, sister, some sort of sibling organization, which we call the Democracy at Work Institute. And so the two of us kind of work in tandem for developing our field in the US. Obviously, internationally and at the very grassroots level, the Federation has a stronger role to play because we're the only national grassroots membership-based organization for worker cooperatives in the US. And so we interface with our peers. Like you guys, I was just hearing yesterday from folks at the Japanese Worker Co-op Federation Union, whatever they call it, that they are getting their Worker Co-op Act or something like that introduced in the floor of the Diet, which is the equivalent of their Congress. So it's that kind of like peer relationship where we're sending updates to each other all around the world and supporting each other. And in fact, we wrote a letter of support for that legislation, which in their context had some sort of clout to it coming from the US. So thank you all for being plugged in to this work. Okay, so I do want to start at the like global level, and I'm not going to dwell there because it doesn't seem like that's where most of the questions are, but the main mission so we have this International Worker Co-op Federation that's been around longer than the US Federation. And their acronym is CICOPA. It's unpacked on this slide, and it basically exists to help to promote and represent worker co-ops, which they, in various languages and cultures, the term is a little different. It's a very Anglophone term to refer to ourselves as worker co-ops. In other contexts, they refer to themselves as like producer, artisan, service cooperatives, but it's basically all the same thing. Just to zoom out again, this is a sense of where they are all over the world. I think in the heyday of coronavirus, one of the things that we realized pretty immediately, for those of you who got to peep this webinar, and if you haven't, it's on our website at the Worker Co-op Federation, we were able to really quickly engage with people all over the world and be like, how is this hitting your countries? What is going on with, worker co-ops? Are they more at risk? Are they more resilient? Like, what are the different ways that you're navigating things? Are you leaning on policy? How are your governments being helpful or harmful? And what are the different kinds of business pivots that some of your businesses have done all over the world? And it was really cool to be able to tap into that. And I would say it wasn't just hearing from, of course, we had the Secretary General from CICOPA speak there, but it wasn't just hearing from those groups. We heard from folks in Turkey, in the cooperative sector there. They don't have a national organization that's plugged into CICOPA. Similarly, in Cuba, they're not allowed to form associations like that, like national associations representing, workers or whatever. But we do have relationships with some of the individual co-ops and movement leaders on the ground there. So just gives us a sense of what we're all connected to, all the way down to being on the ground in Cambridge, Boston, etc. All of your cluster of towns near the Charles. Same thing, a little more simplified, some of the regions where CICOPA's membership is based, and the organizations that represent them, just to zooming in a little bit, and noting that internationally, or globally, I should say, the strongest worker co-op federations and associations are throughout the Americas and throughout Europe. Okay, yeah, we get it. Great. Okay, so one of the things that I like to start sharing when we're getting into the state of the sector is we do an annual economic census of worker co-ops. It's important to do that annually. We've been doing it for about 7 years now, basically ever since we created the Democracy at Work Institute. And so the Worker Co-op Federation and DAWI, we do this work in tandem, not only capturing the economic activity and status and data from our own members, but actually for the sector at large. And this is different from our comrades in other countries who usually have a minister of cooperatives somewhere high up in government. It would be the equivalent of having an agency like the US Department of Agriculture or the Small Business Association, or the EPA. They have a minister of cooperatives in almost every country around the world, because cooperatives are a major important economic backbone for agriculture, for workers, for utilities and electricity, for housing, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, here we are in the United States, and it's a little different here. So this work falls on us to do ourselves, because no one is collecting this data. Certainly no one is collecting it specifically for worker-owned cooperatives. And no one's really funding us to do it either. So we have to sort of like scramble and figure out our own resources for doing this, and sometimes partnering with researchers. So that's where this info is coming from.
We have 3 questions if
yeah.
you want to take them. So Siona asked, what does it take to start a co-op like the first year? How long does it take? What is the temperature of creating and operating a co-op model?
I will say we're gonna do, it might even be next week. I gotta check with Mia about the calendar of which themes we're doing which week. We have a whole webinar that is just focused on worker co-op startups, and we'll dig into the details of that. So hopefully you're able to make that session where we'll get to that.
Second question.
Yeah.
Okay. Besides supporting co-ops by doing business with them, what are other ways to support co-ops? And this is from Kelsey. She would love to see more co-ops, but don't know how to uplift them.
That is the question. That's the best question. That's the question I care the most about, honestly. I will cover some of that toward the end, after some of the sort of information and graphs and maps pieces. But I would say right at the top, a lot of it is staying informed, like knowing what is up. Being here is actually a major way to support. Hearing these stories and then sharing that with people in your world, sharing that casually in conversations. A lot of people aren't very well aware of the scope and structure of cooperatives, especially worker co-ops. So demystifying that, having useful information, following certainly the Worker Co-op Federation, but even some of the different cooperative developers around the country, and the different associations that are organizing co-ops, and some of the cooperative businesses that do a lot of communication stuff on social media. So I think that's so major, because that is the place where you will find out, hey, there's a call to action. Like yesterday, there was a major call to action for folks out in California for directing some of their state budget toward baselining. I think it was like a $10 million ask going toward worker co-op development. We don't always know when those opportunities are going to come up. So it really is like, get on our listserv, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, whichever one of those things you do. And that's, that connectivity is a huge part of how we're able to mobilize our people. Certainly, not only shopping and patronizing the existing cooperative businesses, but donating to cooperative developers. Certainly, we need and use that grassroots financial support, especially for some of the programs that aren't otherwise funded. I mean, right now, as a membership or dues-based organization, a lot of what we're beholden to do is whatever is in the interest of existing cooperatives. They're the ones paying us. You know who's not paying us? Future co-ops that don't exist yet. And there's still a bunch of work that we have to do to organize that field, which is the kind of the part of the context that I'm laying out here. So becoming a stainer of the Worker Co-op Federation. We have links on our website about being a sustainer. We have a campaign right now that's going until International Co-op Day, which is I think this year it's the 4th of July. It's like the first Saturday in July usually. All of those things are ways to support and resource this work. I'll leave it there for now. Yes, it's usworker.coop if someone wouldn't mind chatting that in the chat. I have it on a slide as well. Okay, so you were reading this slide while I was saying that. I will say that, so where are we at? What does this mean? When we do this survey, we have to wait for a whole year to take place. Like, let's say the year of 2018 happened. A bunch of co-ops were doing their business. They were like, we're hiring people, we're doing sales, we're doing everything. We get to December 2018, they close their books. They end the year, they're doing whatever they're doing up until New Year's Eve, right? And then it takes them a couple months to close their books and be like, all right, what actually happened financially in 2018? So they don't actually know that until sometime in February or March of 2019. They finally close their books. We have to wait until they close their books to start our survey process. So we do our survey after the last complete year of activity, cooperative, business, financial activity. And by the time we gather all that info, we're calling people, we're sending out our survey, they're either answering right away or we have to chase them down. We get the info, we compile it, we finally spit it out. By the time that happens, it's like a year later. So the stuff that I'm showing you is our 2019 census that was done collecting data from 2018. And now we're in 2020 and I'm reporting it. That's the latest data that we have. And so it means that we're constantly looking back. It's not possible to know, it's 2020, it's June 2020, what's actually happening. How many co-ops are there? How have they been affected by coronavirus? There's anecdotal things that we know from being in touch with our members, but it's not the same as doing a, coast to coast census. So that's part of what we're looking at here. Additionally, we only gather information about who we can get in touch with. It turns out, and we know this, and there's a lot of academics that talk about the difference between colonial information and what is knowable, like a theory of knowledge. What is the data that you can capture, whether as a researcher or as the state, the government, and what are the things that it's just is not going to be on your radar ever. And so I will say that we do a lot of estimation using regression models and other things. And so when we report what we know, we say, okay, we know that in 2018, we were able to identify 465 of these worker co-ops all around the country in the US. And we actually think there's probably twice that. There might be more like 800 worker co-ops. Why? Well, some of them are you're doing this worker co-op, but you're only doing it 10 hours a week and it's not your full-time job and you're not incorporated and you're hoping that it will be your full-time job 3 years from now, blah, 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 right? That's actually how my worker co-op got started, Aorta. We didn't show up on this census until probably 2015 or 2016, and we were started back in 2010. So because our sector is growing so quickly, that's just a dynamic that's baked into the numbers. So it gives you a sense of where we're at. We actually think that they're closer to 10,000 workers and et cetera, et cetera. All of the numbers are different. But it does give you a sense when we look at the typical co-op. These are small, extremely small businesses. So it's somewhere around 8 to 12 workers. Typically, on average, if you average in the big ones, it's actually closer to 45 or 50 workers per cooperative business. And because the sector is growing so quickly, most co-ops, the typical one, if you just like picked them out of a hat, it would be a co-op that was recently launched, like a new one that's a startup or recently incorporated, or a cooperative business that just recently became a co-op, that it used to be operating forever and ever as a, you know, construction company or landscaping or design or whatever, and then the owners sold it to their coworkers and it became a cooperative. So that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of the sector.
Just gonna really quickly, the chat is blowing up with questions. I just
Boom,
want to
boom,
make sure
boom.
to capture them on the recording. So Siona asked, what is the temperature in Boston area for creating, operating, sustaining a co-op model? And she also asked, what is the way to build financial stability or wealth, i.e. for aging folk? What sort of security is available within a co-op business model? Great question. And Sean asked, what is the average profit difference between worker co-ops and traditional business models? Is there data for that?
Yeah.
Anne Malone asks, is a food co-op a different kind of co-op? She wants to raise up the Dorchester food co-op that's going to be on the corner of Dorchester.
Got it. Getting there to most of those questions. This kind of shows a bit of some of the hot spots of where there are concentrations of co-ops, not based on our estimate of 800 to 1,000 co-ops, but based on our actual who we were able to reach for the 465 co-ops. Now, the question of what does it mean that there's a 23% participation rate? It means that of the 465 that we know are there because we found their website, or we know that they used to exist and they're still around, but they just never got back to us and we called and whatever we did, they never actually participated and said, hi, our workers are, you know, here's who our workers are, and 20% of them are Black workers and 40% of them are white. Like, we don't know that data because they were not included in the numbers, but they were included in our, like, we know we have found and identified 465 co-ops. So that's what that means. When we get into this data about their finances, their pay rates, their ratios, all that stuff, it's based on who actually participated, which was about, you know, 120 co-ops. Okay, so that gives you a sense of concentrations in terms of ecosystems, not based at the state level, but at the city level. You'll notice that the Boston area at 20 co-ops, 19 co-ops, this is again back to 2018, is actually the second highest in the country after California and New York. Other than, well, Puerto Rico is not a city. But yeah, so that's what we're looking at here. You all should be very proud of yourself for having such a robust ecosystem. It actually makes it so much easier to start a co-op. Once you've got 10 or 15 co-ops, the next 10 or 15 are a lot easier to develop than if you're in a place like Los Angeles that only has 5 co-ops and you're like, okay, what are examples? I see that this works in this industry, does it work in another one? What about with Latinx workers who don't speak English? What about if you're in a high capital intensive industry and you're trying to get, you know, a printing press or whatever? Okay, the other ecosystem sort of like piece, this is listing our direct affiliates on the ground, not in a map form, but like these are the organizations all around the country that we work with. We were just getting underway in experimenting with a model of having direct chapters of the Federation in Massachusetts, in Worcester, and in Boston right before the pandemic hit. So we'll see what happens with that when it gets unpaused. But these are just a sense of some of the organizations that are on the ground. They're not all the same. Some of them have staff, some of them have multiple staff, most of them have no staff. A lot of them are volunteers. Some of them are incubated within a nonprofit. They're all over the place. If you're more interested in that, that's a separate question and we can either get into it or in a subsequent session, we can get into it. Who we are on the left, you can look at the sort of by state as opposed to by metro area. concentrations of co-ops. But in terms of who we are, we're about equal numbers of Latinx and white worker owners in terms of the workforce. The numbers vary a little bit year to year, and about 11 to 13%. I think that's the next slide I have is maybe more recent numbers. That's about 11 to 13% Black worker owners, a fair number of multiracial and mixed worker owners, and most of this tracks with the percentage of just the U.S. population overall, except for white and Latinx. So that's kind of where we're at. To the question of industries, now somebody asked the question about, like what's up with food co-ops? Food co-ops confuse everybody because first of all, they're just misnamed. Like what's a food co-op? There are people who grow food, there are people who prepare food, there are people who serve it, there are people who deliver it, there are people doing CSAs, and there's grocery stores. Most of the time when we say food co-ops, we're talking about grocery stores. Why? Because of some weird moment where that became a highly branded identification for grocery cooperatives. Additionally, only some grocery cooperatives are worker owned. Most of them are consumer owned. They're owned by the community. It doesn't matter if you do like a work shift there once every couple months or something, or if you're volunteer on the board, you're not a worker. That's a different thing. You're still, your primary relationship, your stakeholder relationship, the extent to which you own it is equally as one of hundreds or possibly thousands of owners of that grocery store, the population that's shopping there. That's the nature of being part of that kind of a co-op. Whereas some of our members are part of worker-owned grocery store cooperatives. They also call themselves food co-ops because we live in the US. So that includes groups like the entirely Black-owned Mandela grocery co-op in Oakland, the largest worker-owned grocery co-op, which is in San Francisco, called Rainbow Grocery. They've got like 280 workers there. It's just like a massive, massive growth. They're the largest granola seller in the world. So it really runs the gamut. This image shows all the different kind of industries that we break it down into. The interesting thing about worker co-ops is that we don't describe ourselves based on the industry we're in. We're all the people who are the workers, whether we're driving taxis or selling granola or building websites, we're all workers. That's what unites us. And we're all over the place in terms of our industries. It breaks down into a few different larger categories. And so that's what this graph is representing. This is demographics again, gender, race. So it gives you a sense. That was that piece I was saying about white, Latinx, Black, Asian, mixed race, etc. You'll see that there. And I keep zipping along. This gives a sense of the pace of our growth recently. And this is, again, these are the colonial numbers of what was actually verified and identifiable for the number of cooperative businesses. We have never flatlined or decreased. We've only grown since we started collecting data, and even all the way back to our founding 15 years ago. So you'll see we've basically gone from about 300 identifiable co-ops back in 2013 to the 2018 numbers that have us at over 400. Why is that just? Oh, right. Yeah, because I also have 2019 numbers, which is the 465.
Elijah,
do I have a list of co-ops identified in the Boston area? Yes, we absolutely do. If you go to our website, we have a couple things. We have directories that we put out every couple years that we print. And in the front of it, it's organized by the industry. And in the back, there's an index that just says the states. You can just be like, okay, where is Massachusetts? And it turns out that there's actually a ton of co-ops in Massachusetts. It's one of the longest listings. If you go to our website, there's a digital directory where you can actually put in a filter and be like, all right, who has a zip code in Boston or in Cambridge or in Massachusetts overall, and search by that type. Or you can go and search and say, look, I just want somebody who can do language interpretation for an event. who does language interpretation in all of the US as a worker co-op. And you can filter by that and find it. Okay, this is not that deep. This gives you a sense of how co-ops get started. Still overwhelmingly, it gets started as an entrepreneurial event, a startup of some sort. Increasingly, conversions, meaning taking a traditional business that's already up and running and converting it to becoming worker owned, that is growing as a pie slice over time. And the little red slice that says other or unknown, that includes everything from an incubation or a franchise or just something funky like a multi-stakeholder co-op or something else that might come out of it. So sometimes it's hard to track or hard to tell how exactly some of those groups started. Okay, I think there was a question about wages and how it compares to traditional industries. We have our State of the Sector report, which is why I'm gonna do some shortcuts and zip through some of these slides, because you can download it from our website and it aggregates a lot of this information for you, including how it compares to traditional industries. I will say that, not only has our average hourly wage increased dramatically over the last 3 or so years by almost 25%. Wait, that's not how percentages work. Anyway, 30%, anyway, a lot. But the patronage dividends, which is basically an allocation of surplus. In a traditional business, you would just call that profit. You're like, cool, we paid all our bills, we paid all of our obligations, here's what's left over at the end of the year because we've done well. Hopefully you do well enough that happens. You then chop that up and divide it proportionally based on how many hours people worked is usually how it's done. And so that's an additional income that's not a wage or a salary. It's just profit sharing. Grocery food co-ops that are consumer owned do the same thing. You might get a check for, I don't think I've ever gotten a check for more than like 16 or 30 bucks from a food co-op that I've been a member of. But in a worker co-op, you get checks that are hundreds or thousands of dollars. And so the average, for us in the US at least, the average worker owner who receives a patronage check of the groups who we surveyed are getting an extra like 8,000 bucks of profit sharing that they're taking home. This gets at that wage ratio, which for worker co-ops, nobody's typically paid more than twice what someone else in their co-op is paid. And that's actually vastly different from traditional corporations where the pay rate ratio is like, 303 to 1. In more civilized countries, there are laws saying, I'm sorry, you can't make more than 35 times your lowest paid worker. We don't live in that kind of environment. So we live in a country where the ratio is 303 to 1, which is of course ridiculous. But this gives a sense of the difference in worker co-ops. In terms of our challenges, and this gets at the question of how do you support them and what does it take for them to thrive and be successful? Overwhelmingly, it's things like health insurance and worker benefits. So that's what the Federation does increasingly as we've been able to grow, is filling in for the kind of things that worker co-ops haven't been able to do themselves. If you have a business that's just 12 or 15 or 30 people, they might not have figured out how to get an HSA plan or a dental plan or set up a 401k. So we're filling in that infrastructure and making it so that even if you start a business that doesn't have the capacity to research that or to vet some of the providers that would do those kinds of things that a union might do in a traditional business or that management would do in a traditional business, that we're able to fill in those gaps. We're not all the way there yet. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important to support groups like the Worker Co-op Federation when you can. We just in January had enough resources to hire somebody whose full-time job is administering the benefits that we have set up around a national dental plan, a national vision plan, and researching retirement and pension options, and even direct access to clinics for people, whether it's because of their documentation status or other reasons, might need access to alternative forms of healthcare. So that gives you a sense of what all the different kinds of issues are. We do organize ourselves in the field to plug in all different kinds of gaps, whether that's business planning and technical assistance, marketing, legal, things like that. We've just spent the last 3 months helping co-ops navigate access to the PPP loans from the Small Business Administration, and even advocating so that co-ops were included, because they weren't until we mobilized our people, mobilized our folks in Washington, D.C., sent letters, phone calls, all of that stuff. And they did grant access to consumer and worker co-ops because of our efforts. But literally, we were just not going to be included at all until that happened. You can download the report. Hooray. Institute.coop, that is for the Democracy at Work Institute. If you start with our website, you can also click through and it will guide you toward where you can find the report. But you can find it easily at institute.coop. It will be the one that says 2019, even though right now it's 2020. And even though the info was about mostly 2018. Although I think the latest one we did, we were able to turn around the data quicker. A little bit about how we organize and what's going on these days before we wrap. We, within the Federation, organize in 4 different kind of main member councils. There's a Racial and Economic Justice Council. We do advocacy, immigrant organizing, etc. We also group some of the different co-op industry, the industries that people are in together. So there's like one that we're starting this year for worker-owned food co-ops, and or democratically managed food co-ops, and they're all getting together. So that gives you a sense of that level of organizing. We do a lot of advocacy. I was just talking about that. Look at us, we're cute, we're in the Hill, we're visiting Senate halls. Some of our people in California who've been doing that organizing I was just talking about. So a little bit about this is like our priorities for who we're reaching out to and involving at different levels at the local, state, and federal level. And I'm not going to get deeper into that because I didn't see questions about it. What those priorities are, it ranges from education to building out infrastructure around, policies and access to things like government loan funds in the case of the Small Business Administration, and doing strategic work with legislative staff. Usually are the people we talk to. As part of COVID response, we were working with a congressman out who's based in California, Ro Khanna. You probably see him on MSNBC all the time. He was a huge surrogate for Bernie Sanders during the primaries on a National Worker Co-op Development Act. That would actually, we identified what are the biggest pain points and what are the things that need to either change or that need to be created, or we just need access to certain programs. So it goes for everything from tax stuff to ways that our movement can fund ourselves. We said, well, what if we did what we learned from Spain and Italy, where their government sets aside the business taxes that they pay in those taxes, and they take a percentage of those taxes and they fuel right back into worker co-op development. So they've been able to scale their movements massively over just a handful of decades because they're funding themselves. That's not rocket science. That's not asking for new dollars from the government. We're literally just saying, this is what our own businesses are paying into the IRS. Can you set aside, half a percentage of what we pay in and feed it back out into all the development organizations here so that people are able to provide information, technical assistance, et cetera, including, revolving loan funds or grants or startup capital, things like that. That's what we've learned from our partners overseas in places like Argentina and Western Europe. So it gives you a sense of that. Oh yeah, and then so some of our vision and strategies for the future, these are questions that I both am seeing in the chat and that we're actively thinking through in a broader movement space, but also on our board and our staff, and in our member councils. What makes for worker co-ops to be resilient and strong and cared for? It does mean that it's not enough to just launch your business if there isn't somebody to help connect you to healthcare or to make it affordable beyond what Obamacare offers, or to give you technical assistance around your financial projections, or some of the different things that we end up doing to help worker co-ops. The work that I was talking about around our member councils and peer networks, that connectivity matters. If you're the only person in Texas that is doing landscaping as a worker co-op, it might be really helpful to be able to connect to a yard and a half in the Boston area who does landscaping, and to compare notes and to be like, hey, what is your PPP plan? How have you guys been able to protect your work crew and get back to work? Or what are your assessments in holding off on doing that? So right now, the only way they can find each other really is through us, or the easiest way to find each other is through us. Solidarity in social economic justice movements. I was mentioning that at the very beginning. Tomorrow, I'm doing an Instagram takeover for the New Economy Coalition, which of course is mostly based in Cambridge and Boston, but is national. And you know, that's just an example of what it looks like to do that storytelling, to connect the dots, to tell people like that brilliant question that you just asked, like, okay, we get it. We want to support this. We want to see more worker co-ops. That's part of how we undo capitalism and we put wealth back into communities, especially for Black, Brown, and communities of color and queer and indigenous communities, et cetera. How do we make that happen? Organizations like that, those kinds of relationships are really helpful. The New Economy Coalition helped connect us to the Rising Majority for an event that we had with Ayanna Pressley, AOC, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib back in February. And I was able to ask them a question very directly about exactly this, like what are some of the opportunities for scaling worker co-op growth and cooperative growth, even more broadly with land trusts and things like that. And you know, we probably would not have had those connections and that reach for participating in a forum like that otherwise. So we see that as instrumental. Cooperative businesses to thrive. I think that sometimes people forget that the bread and butter of co-ops is the business stuff. And sometimes that can be like not the sexiest piece, but understanding finances, understanding how to facilitate and run meetings, how to resolve conflict and de-escalate things, how to set up decent policies without having to reinvent it all on your own, because we already have a repository of hundreds of cooperative members who figured this out, and there might be ones that you can borrow from. We have a very open source culture. People are very happy to share their HR policies, or so you know, I think a lot of it comes down to that. We're so used to having a spirit of doing it ourselves that we forget that organizations like the Worker Co-op Federation are there to support, and people forget to reach out or forget that those resources exist. Maybe I'll leave it there with those questions. I'll just shout out that longer term, we do have this this national conference that we do typically every other year. Because it's virtual this year, we're going to have one in person in 2021. God willing, there'll be a vaccine by then. But anyone can register. This is going to be like low stakes. I believe we're doing it for free or for suggested donation or something. That'll be in September. And that's my last slide.
Awesome. Great job, Esteban.
I told you it was going to be a lot to sort of churn through in terms of the orientation. But I think the idea talking with Nia was, you know, anyone who's interested in these topics and these issues, we kind of have to pull back and start at this like overwhelming level of like, what are all the things? Where is it happening? What's the geography of this? What are the, right? So that you have a sense of like, who are we? Where are we? What's happening? What's the sort of cutting edge of this stuff? And then you can start getting more particular. So I think the sessions that we're doing going forward, there's one on financial literacy, there's one on worker co-op development, just like a super basic, much slower one on like 101 level thing. There's stuff around conflict resolution, facilitation. And I think that there's one that we're setting up that's specifically lifting up the history in communities of color, the long history of cooperative traditions, especially around worker ownership in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities in the US. So those are all things that will have their own time to shine, but we wanted to set a backdrop to get us all started.
I am so excited for this series. Thank you, Esteban, again. I'm going to stop recording. As you guys can see, we will be having more conversations about these co-ops. So tell your friends to tell your friend to tell your friend to show up on Wednesdays. It's going to be awesome. All right, we're going to